There is a type of pain that does not scream but consumes in silence. It is the pain of a father or mother who, upon reaching maturity, realizes that their children have distanced themselves, not just physically, but emotionally. The phone that does not ring, the visit that never happens, the forgotten birthdays, the prolonged silences, as if the presence of those we love most were now dispensable. For those who have dedicated decades to raising, supporting, and caring for their children, this absence can feel like a silent betrayal. And more than that, a blow to their identity. Freud said that what is not processed in the unconscious returns as a symptom. The abandonment of a child is not just an external fact, it is an internal impact, profound and structural. It activates regions of the soul that often remain dormant for years until something or someone awakens in them the old fear of not being loved, of not being needed, of being disposable. This happens because the departure of a child, especially in adulthood, hurts the emotional structure that many parents have built over decades, the idea that family love is eternal, unconditional, and guaranteed. But psychoanalysis shows us that the bond between parents and children is not immune to human failings. No bond survives unscathed by frustrations, misunderstandings, and unrequited idealizations. Freud studied in depth how these idealizations form usually in childhood, and how, when broken, they cause enormous suffering. When a child leaves home, they don't just break a routine of living together. They break with an emotional role that was assigned to them from an early age, that of giving meaning to their parents' existence. This is the crucial point. Many people, when they become parents, begin to place all the meaning of their own lives on their children, educating, protecting, working to support them, sacrificing oneself to ensure their future. All of this seems natural. But in many cases, there is an unconscious desire for recognition, reciprocity, even compensation. When this does not happen, when children follow their own paths without looking back, the feeling is not just one of loss, it is one of internal collapse, as if everything had been in vain. And this is exactly where Freud invites us to look inward. Because what hurts is not just the other person's gesture, it is what that gesture awakens within us. Psychoanalysis teaches us that all relational pain is, at the same time, a mirror. The abandonment we experience today may take the form of the present, but its roots lie in the past. Often this suffering carries echoes of poorly processed childhood experiences, an emotional absence of one's parents, a need that was never acknowledged, a void that was filled by absolute dedication to one's children. By understanding this, we begin to realize that healing will not come from changing others, but from our own internal transformation. Freud proposed that the path of analysis is a return to the origins of pain, not to remain stuck there, but to rediscover what has been lost: self-love, emotional autonomy, the ability to exist beyond bonds. In this video, we will follow this path. In 7 topics, we will explore why the absence of children hurts us so much, what Freud revealed about the psychic mechanisms that sustain this pain, and above all, how it is possible to begin a real healing process, even after 50, 60, or 70 years of age. It is never too late to rescue yourself. It's never too late to understand what still hurts, and it's never too late to transform pain into freedom. Sigmund Freud was one of the first thinkers to describe in depth the impact of the early years of life on the formation of the adult mind. For him, childhood is the terrain where the psychic maps that determine much of the emotions, choices, and pain we carry throughout our existence are drawn. From this perspective, abandonment, real or symbolic, during the first emotional bonds, especially between parents and children, can constitute a primary trauma. This type of trauma is not a simple, isolated episode, but an emotional event that imprints a deep sense of insecurity on the unconscious, a mark that can manifest itself at various times in adult life, especially when there is a significant separation, such as the distancing of a child. For Freud, abandonment directly affects the structure of the ego, what we call the self. And when the ego is threatened with losing the love or care of another, a series of psychological mechanisms are triggered. This is where the so-called drives come in, fundamental forces that govern human behavior. Freud identified two major basic drives, eros and thanatos. The first, the life drive, eros, drives human beings to form bonds, seek pleasure, preserve life and love. The second, the death drive, thanatos, acts in the opposite way. It leads to the repetition of suffering, the desire to return to an inorganic state, self-sabotage, and the destruction of bonds. When a child is emotionally neglected or experiences the emotional absence of their caregivers, their life drive is weakened. The desire for connection, trust, and surrender is compromised. The world begins to seem like an unstable place where love can disappear without warning. And so, the death drive finds space to manifest itself in small destructive behaviors, including against oneself, chronic insecurity, self-deprecation, fear of being abandoned again, and the need to please others to avoid rejection. Another important concept within this logic is narcissistic fixation. Freud described narcissism as an essential stage of development in which the baby does not yet distinguish between self and other. Everything revolves around them, and the love they receive from their parents is absorbed as an extension of their own existence. When there is abandonment at this stage, whether through physical absence, emotional coldness, or instability in care, the child may become fixated at this stage, developing a fragile ego that is dependent on the validation of others. This narcissistic fixation causes the individual to relate to others, and especially to their children, in adulthood based on an unconscious need for fulfillment. They expect their children to repair what was lost in the past, to offer a kind of unconditional and constant love, often idealized. And when that child leaves, the adult feels not only sadness or disappointment. They relive, in their unconscious, the original trauma of rejection. The pain is multiplied because it is not new. It is a repetition, a reenactment of the primary wound. Freud observed in several patients that when these childhood traumas are not worked through, they tend to repeat themselves in different forms. This is what he called the compulsion to repeat. The subject, without realizing it, places themselves in situations similar to those that hurt them in the past, as if unconsciously seeking a way to give a new ending to an old story. Thus, the estrangement of a child can reopen a wound that was not caused by them, but which they symbolically represent. This is why the reaction to a child's distance can often seem disproportionate. The suffering does not refer only to the present, but to the sum of all the moments when that adult has felt invisible, helpless, or discarded. Understanding this dynamic is the first step in transforming abandonment into a starting point for self-knowledge. Freud never promised a quick cure, but he clearly showed that the mind can be unraveled, and that by recognizing our oldest wounds, we begin to reframe our current pain. The absence of a child, although painful, can lead us to a deeper reconnection with ourselves. If you enjoy reflections like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. When the trauma of abandonment is not processed, its effects do not disappear over time. They transform, they change form, adapt to the stages of life, and settle in deep places in the adult mind. Freud warned that the unconscious does not obey chronological time. It functions as a reservoir where everything that has been repressed, not understood or experienced with psychic intensity, remains active even without the subject's awareness. Thus, childhood abandonment can manifest itself years later in psychological symptoms that appear to have no direct connection to childhood. The person may not remember the exact moment when they were neglected, but they carry the emotional consequences of this throughout their life. One of the most common symptoms is depression. Not the kind that arises only from recent losses, but a constant sadness, a feeling of emptiness that accompanies the person even in moments of stability. This type of depression is often linked to a lack of secure emotional references in the early years of life. Freud associated melancholy with internalized loss. That is, when someone loses an object of love, such as the affection or attention of a caregiver, and that loss is not consciously symbolized, it turns into guilt and self-recrimination. The individual begins to feel that there is something wrong with them, that they are not worthy of affection, even if they do not know where this feeling comes from. This unconscious guilt is one of the roots of the persistent low self-esteem that many people carry with them. Another frequent impact is separation anxiety. Even in stable relationships, adults who have experienced childhood abandonment may live in constant fear of being left. This fear does not only manifest itself with children, it appears in friendships, marriages, and even professional relationships. The person may become hypervigilant, interpreting small absences as signs of rejection. All it takes is a delay, a change in tone of voice, or a lack of response for the internal alarm to go off, reviving the pain of the original abandonment. These emotional patterns also shape the way the person relates to others. Some develop avoidant bonds. They avoid forming deep ties for fear of being hurt again. They are the ones who maintain emotional distance even in close relationships. They have difficulty trusting, asking for help, and showing vulnerability. Behind their exaggerated independence is often a defense mechanism against the suffering that abandonment has already caused. Other people take the opposite path. They become codependent. They give too much of themselves, sacrifice excessively, and have difficulty setting boundaries. They do everything to keep others close, even if it means personal suffering. Freud drew attention to this type of repetition, the unconscious attempt to repair the original pain through current relationships. Deep down, adults seek in others what they did not receive in childhood, and therefore submit themselves to unbalanced relationships, hoping for recognition, security, or unconditional love. Take, for example, the fictional story of Marta, a 62-year-old woman. Since she was young, she has been accustomed to taking care of others. She raised 3 children practically alone, giving up her own life to ensure their future. When she retired, she expected frequent visits, phone calls, and displays of affection. But that didn't happen. Today, she lives with a feeling of uselessness and deep sadness. When her children distanced themselves, she didn't just suffer from their absence. She suffered because, without realizing it, she had placed the meaning of her existence in them. Now any silence is interpreted as abandonment, a repetition of what she once felt toward her own parents. Freud taught that in order for a symptom to dissolve, it must be understood. Naming what we feel, seeking the psychological roots of our patterns, and recognizing how we repeat the pains of the past are fundamental steps toward healing. The abandonment of a child can indeed be devastating, but it can also be a mirror of an older wound. And by recognizing it, we open up the possibility of breaking cycles, transforming bonds, and regaining emotional dignity. Because pain, when seen clearly, ceases to imprison us. Sigmund Freud developed one of the most important contributions to the understanding of human suffering, the theory of defense mechanisms. These mechanisms are unconscious strategies that the ego uses to deal with internal conflicts and intense anxieties. When abandonment, especially of a child, presents itself as a reality too painful to face directly, the mind resorts to these defenses to protect its psychological integrity. However, what protects can also imprison. The continued use of these defenses can prevent a person from processing their pain and finding paths to healing. Among the most common mechanisms in response to abandonment is repression. Freud described repression as the process by which unacceptable or threatening content is banished from consciousness. In the context of abandonment, this manifests itself when the individual avoids thinking or talking about the absence of their child, as if silence could erase reality. Repression does not eliminate pain. It only pushes it into the unconscious, where it continues to operate indirectly, emerging in physical symptoms, disturbing dreams, or disproportionate emotional reactions. Another very common mechanism is denial. The person refuses to accept that they have been abandoned or that they are suffering from the separation. They may say things like, "He has his own life, it doesn't bother me," or "I expected this." Behind these statements is often an attempt to avoid the internal collapse that full acceptance of reality could cause. Denial, although useful, at first prevents deep emotional processing. The denied pain remains active, even if it is not named. Projection is another frequent resource. In it, the individual attributes to the other feelings or intentions that are actually within themselves. Instead of acknowledging their own hurt, guilt, or resentment, the person says that their child is angry with them or is ungrateful. Although this may have some basis in reality, it is often a reflection of emotions that the subject cannot tolerate in themselves. Projection prevents self-knowledge and fuels conflict in relationships. According to Freud, these mechanisms are defenses of the ego. The ego, pressured by the demands of the superego, the moral authority, and the unconscious forces of the ID, repressed desires, tries to maintain a balance. But this balance is fragile when there is no conscious elaboration. That is why people who suffer abandonment often oscillate between rationalizations and emotional outbursts. They say they don't care, but they cry when they hear their child's name. They claim to be strong, but they live in a constant state of anguish. Let's look at the fictional example of Roberto, a 67-year-old man who was abandoned by his son after a family conflict. He often tells his friends that he doesn't mind, that his son made his choice and that he is moving on. However, at the slightest sign of affection, an unexpected visit from a nephew, a phone call from a neighbor, he becomes intensely emotional. In his dreams, he relives situations from the past with his son, and in casual conversations he often mentions episodes from the boy's childhood, without even realizing it. Roberto represses his grief over the loss of the relationship, denies its importance, and projects all responsibility for the estrangement onto his son. Freud understood that suffering becomes chronic when a person is unable to look at themselves honestly. By using these defenses, the mind tries to preserve itself but ends up perpetuating the pain. This is why many people avoid talking about the estrangement of their children. Not because they don't feel it, but because they feel it too much. Silence is not the absence of feeling, it is excess. It is the inability to find words for something that touches layers so deep that they escape language. Recognizing defense mechanisms is the beginning of transformation. When a person realizes that they are denying, repressing, or projecting, they begin to create internal space to deal with the truth. Not an absolute truth, but a personal, emotional truth that needs to be heard. Psychoanalysis does not require that defenses be abandoned at once, but that they be acknowledged. Because it is in this awareness that the possibility of choice lies. And where there is choice, there is freedom. For Freud, the unconscious is not just a repository of forgotten memories, but an active part of the mind that continues to influence behaviors, feelings, and choices long after certain events have occurred. It is where repressed desires, unprocessed traumas, and unexpressed emotions are found. Abandonment, when experienced intensely, especially in the early stages of life, does not disappear. Even when it is not clearly remembered, it continues to operate in the unconscious as a structuring force of the psychic identity. The self, or the I, is shaped by these early experiences. Even if the subject has moved on with their life, started a family, worked and built a routine, the unconscious content continues to act, determining how they see themselves and others. In the case of abandonment, this influence is particularly powerful. The unconscious memory of rejection can generate, for example, a diffuse feeling of inadequacy, constant doubt about one's own worth, or an excessive need for approval. These feelings do not arise from the present, but from something that was inscribed in the psychic past and remains unnamed. Freud observed that unconscious content manifests itself mainly through automatic behaviors, slips, symptoms, and, above all, in dreams. When a parent experiences the estrangement of a child and says, "I don't understand why this hurts so much," it is the unconscious speaking. The rational mind tries to find explanations, but the pain does not come from the immediate present. It comes from deeper layers, where the first experiences of love, loss, desire, and frustration are recorded. These unconscious memories do not fade with time. They persist, and they influence us. A parent who was emotionally abandoned in childhood may repeat this pattern in future relationships, sometimes as the abandoner, sometimes as the one who fears being left again. This repetition is not conscious. It is an attempt by the unconscious to work through what was left unresolved. Freud called this the return of the repressed. What was repressed returns, but not as a clear memory. It returns as a symptom, as repetition, as constant discomfort. This action of the unconscious prevents the healing process precisely because it interferes with the perception of reality. The person abandons or is abandoned, but does not realize that they are reliving an old story. In the case of parents who suffer from their children's estrangement, the pain is often not only in what the child did or failed to do, but in what it represents internally. The child's absence reactivates the pain of the child who, one day, also felt invisible. Let's take Helena, a 64-year-old woman, as a fictional example. After years of dedication to her family, she saw her children drift away. There were no fights, no major conflicts, just a gradual silence. Helena did not understand why this silence hurt her so much. In therapy, she realized that there had been emotional neglect on her mother's part during her childhood. She always had to prove her worth. She was always afraid of not being good enough. When her children stopped seeking her out, her conscious mind interpreted it as ingratitude. But her unconscious mind revived the old wound of maternal rejection, and that wound, still open, was projected onto her children. Freud claimed that we are made up, in large part, of unconscious material. Therefore, it is not enough to rationalize pain. You have to listen to it in its true language, the language of repressed emotions. The unconscious does not speak with words. It expresses itself in dreams, physical sensations, and inexplicable impulses. Therefore, the healing process requires deep listening, a willingness to confront what lies behind repetitive behaviors and intense emotions. Abandonment, by touching the structure of the self, shows us that true emotional liberation does not lie in changing others, but in recognizing what still lives within us. Because as long as the unconscious carries the unprocessed memory of abandonment, any separation will be experienced as a new wound. But by bringing what was once hidden into consciousness, we begin the journey back to psychological wholeness and the freedom to live relationships without the chains of the past. Within Freud's psychoanalytic theory, one of the most transformative concepts is that of transference. This is the process by which the patient, during the therapeutic journey, transfers feelings, expectations, and conflicts that originally belong to important figures from the past, especially parents, to the analyst. This phenomenon is not a mistake of the mind, but a gateway to a deep understanding of the emotional bonds that have marked the individual and continue to influence how they relate to others and themselves. Transference manifests itself spontaneously. The patient begins to perceive the analyst not only as a professional, but as someone who symbolically represents significant people in their history. Sometimes they project onto them the absent father, the demanding mother, the favored sibling. And in this process, they relive emotions that were repressed: anger, resentment, longing, fear of abandonment. It is in this transference scenario that it becomes possible to reframe the past and begin to heal old wounds. In the case of those who suffer from child abandonment, transference can reveal content that until then remained obscure. A father who feels rejected by his child may, in his relationship with the analyst, reproduce this same feeling of rejection, expecting to be ignored, misunderstood, or abandoned again. But the analyst, by maintaining attentive and neutral listening, offers a unique opportunity to live a new emotional experience. Unlike the previous experience, this new relationship, stable, reliable, non-judgmental, allows the patient to experience another form of bonding. Freud realized that transference, far from being an obstacle, is the very engine of analysis. When the patient transfers their affections, they bring the marks of the past into the present. And when the analyst recognizes and interprets this movement, the unconscious begins to become conscious. It is at this point that the symptom can be understood and the pain transformed. In addition to transference, Freud used two essential methods to access unconscious content: dream interpretation and free association. Dreams, according to him, are the royal road to the unconscious. In them, repressed desires are disguised as symbolic images, revealing what the conscious mind cannot or will not admit. For example, a recurring dream of being left behind may express a fear of being forgotten by one's children, but it may also bring back childhood memories of when the individual felt emotionally abandoned by their own parents. Free association, in turn, invites the patient to speak without censorship, allowing thoughts, memories, and images to arise spontaneously. In doing so, unconscious content begins to emerge. Often, in the midst of seemingly trivial accounts, deep conflicts are revealed. A comment about a photograph can awaken a forgotten memory. A detail about a child's gesture can bring to mind the echo of an old gesture made by the mother. Analysis, in this sense, is a delicate work of excavation. Take the example of Ernesto, a 70-year-old man who sought analysis after realizing that he avoided any contact with his adult children. He felt resentful but couldn't explain why. Over the course of the sessions, he began to talk about his own childhood, marked by an absent father and a silent mother. Over time, he realized that he had transferred onto his children the expectation of receiving the care he never had. When this did not happen, he felt the old pain again, but now intensified. In his relationship with the analyst, he was able to express his anger, his frustration, and above all, his sadness. By interpreting his dreams, which always involved scenes of loneliness, he understood that he carried a feeling of abandonment that came from long before he became a father. In the Freudian view, healing does not lie in erasing the past, but in giving it new meaning. The analytical relationship, through transference, offers this space, a place where repetitions cease to be unconscious and can finally be understood. And what was once only pain becomes learning. Abandonment in this process does not disappear, but is transformed. From a silent wound, it becomes a story that can be told, heard, and above all, accepted. Although psychoanalysis was originally conceived as a clinical process conducted between analyst and patient, many of its principles can be applied with seriousness and discipline to everyday life. Freud saw psychoanalysis not only as a therapeutic technique, but as a method of deep investigation of the human soul. From this perspective, it is possible to cultivate self-awareness through practices that help illuminate the unconscious content that shapes behaviors and emotions. One of the most accessible tools is free writing. It is a simple but powerful exercise inspired by Freud's method of free association. The goal is to write for a few minutes every day, without censorship, without structure, without worrying about grammar or logic. The important thing is to allow thoughts and feelings to flow as they come. Over time, this habit begins to reveal patterns, recurring themes, and emotions that are normally silenced. Often, what appears on paper is truer than what we can say out loud. Another fundamental exercise is to analyze your own behavior patterns. This requires attention and courage. It involves honestly observing how you react to certain situations. Why do certain words hurt more than they should? Why is it so difficult to say no? Why do you avoid certain encounters or conversations? These questions have no easy answers, but when asked sincerely, they begin to crack the rigidity of the ego. Over time, it is worth recording these observations in a personal journal. Eventually, you will begin to notice patterns, and every unconscious pattern, as Freud said, has a story behind it. Keeping a dream journal is also a recommended practice. Freud considered dreams to be messages from the unconscious, formulated in symbolic language. Writing down your dreams as soon as you wake up, even if they seem confusing or meaningless, is a way to access content that the conscious mind tends to repress. Often, figures that appear in dreams represent aspects of the self or important people in your emotional life. A recurring absence, for example, may be linked to the pain of abandonment. A house in ruins may reflect a feeling of inner helplessness. By rereading dreams regularly, symbolic patterns begin to emerge. Another important practice is mapping recurring emotions. We all have a kind of emotional signature. Some people live under the weight of guilt, others feel anger easily, some live with constant melancholy. Recording daily which emotions arise, in which situations and with what intensity, helps to build an emotional map. This map is a mirror of the psyche, and when we look closely at this mirror, we begin to recognize where certain pains come from and why we react in certain ways. These tools require commitment. They do not offer immediate relief, but they open a path to deep, inner listening. Self-awareness, in this context, is not an exercise in judgment but in acceptance. Freud insisted that the first step toward healing is recognizing what one is experiencing. Naming an emotion is taking away its destructive power. Seeing a pattern is creating the possibility of interrupting it. Listening to a dream is allowing the unconscious to speak rather than remaining imprisoned in silence. Take the example of Julia, a 68-year-old woman who felt deeply hurt by her children's distance. When she started an emotional journal, she realized that her sadness was often tinged with feelings of rejection that did not come only from her children, but dated back to her youth. Rereading her writings, she noticed that she demanded attitudes from her children that she actually wished she had received from her own mother. This discovery was not easy, but it allowed her to begin to separate the present from the past, and with that, lighten the weight of her expectations. These exercises are not a substitute for therapy, but they can serve as a starting point or ongoing support for those who want to delve deeper into themselves. The most important thing is to be consistent and sincere. The unconscious, even when repressed, leaves traces, and self-awareness is the path that leads to rediscovering forgotten parts of ourselves. When we recognize and name our wounds, we not only understand them, we begin, little by little, to heal them. After diving into unconscious content, recognizing repetitive patterns, and understanding the origins of pain, an essential moment arises in the psychoanalytic journey, the possibility of rebuilding the way we relate to others. Freud claimed that by making the unconscious conscious, the subject gains the freedom to make new choices. This is especially true for emotional bonds, which, when they do not go through the process of elaboration, are often governed by old scripts, based on wounds, fantasies, and idealizations. Healing is not a return to the starting point, but the creation of a new path. The pain of abandonment, when understood, does not disappear as if by magic, but it loses its paralyzing power. By working through this wound, individuals begin to see their relationships more clearly, with fewer projections and unrealistic expectations. It is in this space of understanding that one can redefine the meaning of affection. Reframing the bond with one's children, for example, does not require them to change. Rather, it requires a change in one's relationship with one's own history. Many parents, upon becoming aware of their childhood needs, realize that they were unconsciously demanding reparation from their children. They expected from them what they did not receive in the past. By recognizing this mechanism, the relationship can become lighter, based on respect for the other as they are, rather than on the demand that they be what was missing. In addition, analysis makes it possible to regain authentic self-esteem, which no longer depends on external validation. People begin to realize that they are not defined by the love or absence of their children, but by what they build in their own lives. With this, new possibilities for relationships emerge. Bonds that are not formed out of need, but out of choice. Relationships in which there is exchange, presence, and acceptance, not just expectation. In this context, many people rediscover the value of true friendships. Relationships that have been neglected for years due to exclusive dedication to the family can be resumed with a new perspective. It is also common among those who have healed their wounds to want to get involved in volunteer or community activities. Caring for others, offering time and presence can be deeply healing, as long as it does not serve as a substitute, but as an expansion of the capacity to love. Creating new narratives of connection also involves setting healthy boundaries. People who previously gave themselves completely, expecting love in return, learn to say no without guilt, to protect their time, and to respect their own rhythms. This does not mean closing oneself off to others, but rather building bonds, where affection is not confused with sacrifice. Take the fictional example of Marcelo, a 66-year-old man who, after years of feeling abandoned by his children, began attending a reading group in his community. Gradually, he developed sincere friendships, rediscovered the pleasure of sharing ideas, and, as a result, regained some of his emotional vitality. With less emotional baggage toward his children, he began to communicate with them more openly and lightly. Although the frequency of his encounters with his children did not change much, the quality of the relationship was transformed because his expectations were no longer shaped by absence but guided by reality. Analytical work does not erase the past, but it allows the subject to understand it in a different light. And with that, it becomes possible to create a new narrative about oneself. Someone who has been hurt, yes, but who chooses to move forward with dignity. Someone who acknowledges their pain but no longer uses it as a filter for all relationships. Someone who can build bonds without nullifying themselves because they have finally learned to be whole. These new narratives are not fantasies. They are possible realities sustained by conscious choices. And although they do not cancel out what has been experienced, they usher in a new stage, that of emotional maturity, where freedom is not the absence of pain, but the ability to live without it determining every step. Throughout this reflection, we have explored the main foundations of Freudian psychoanalysis as applied to the pain of abandonment, especially when experienced by parents in later stages of life. We began by understanding abandonment not only as a present event, but as a reactivation of old traumas deeply embedded in the unconscious. Freud taught us that all present pain carries echoes of past pain, and it is in this reunion between what was and what still is that the work of healing begins. We explored the concept of primary trauma, which shows how emotional absence in the early years of life can permanently mark an individual's emotional structure. We also saw that, when not processed, this wound manifests itself in the form of symptoms: persistent sadness, insecurity, difficulty trusting, and unbalanced relationship patterns. Freud pointed out that without conscious access to these roots, we repeat the same sufferings in new forms, what he called the compulsion to repeat. We also discussed the defense mechanisms that the ego builds to survive pain: repression, denial, projection. These psychic resources, although protective, ultimately hinder contact with emotional truth. We showed that it is in the unconscious that these experiences lodge and continue to act, silently influencing behaviors and bonds. Through transference, another central concept in Freud, we understand that it is possible to reframe these experiences, especially within an analytical relationship. Their old emotions are relived, understood, and integrated. And for those who are not in analysis, we present practical tools: free writing, dream journaling, emotional mapping, and pattern observation. These are simple exercises, but they are deeply transformative when practiced consistently and sincerely. Finally, we talk about the possibility of constructing new narratives of connection, relationships based on conscious choice, not need, bonds formed from emotional integrity, not deprivation, experiencing maturity not as a passive wait for affection, but as a time of reconstruction, presence, and meaning. If you see yourself somewhere along this path, know that it is never too late to look within. Seeking professional help is an act of courage, not weakness, and every small step towards self-awareness counts. Healing abandonment does not erase the past, but it gives us the freedom to write a new future. If this reflection resonated with you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to receive more reflections like this one. That way, you won't miss any new content. Take care and see you next time.